60,000 spears followed Mahmud to erase the ancient house, but Al-Azeez sent only birds with lentil stones, and by dusk the valley of Muhassir was a heaving mash of meat and mail, while the Kaaba stood alone, calm as if nothing had happened at all. The year was 570, though the desert winds carried the dust of an eternity that cared nothing for the calendars of men. In the southern highlands of Yemen, in the city of Sana'a, a monstrosity of stone and vanity was rising from the earth to scrape the belly of the heavens. This was not merely a church, it was a declaration of war against the ancient order, a structure birthed from the fevered ambition of one man whose face bore the jagged scar of a blade and whose heart was hardened like the volcanic rock of the plateau. Abraha al-Ashram, the vice-regent of the Abyssinian king, sat upon his throne draped in silk and watched as the sun glinted off the golden dome of his creation, a cathedral he named Al-Kulays. He had decreed that this edifice would outshine the stars themselves, constructed of marble variegated in white and yellow, teakwood brought from the farthest reaches of the east, and mosaics that shimmered with the stolen light of 1,000 fires. Yet, beneath the polished floors and the gilded altars lay a foundation mortared with the blood and pulverized bones of the laborers who had perished under the lash to satisfy his haste. The air within the cathedral was thick, heavy with the scent of expensive musk and burning oud, meant to mask the stench of death that clung to the construction site like a pestilence, for Abraha believed that he could sanitize tyranny with perfume and dazzle the world into submission with opulence. His obsession was singular and maddening. Northward, across the barren and inhospitable dunes, lay the city of Mecca, a humble settlement that possessed no rivers, no orchards, and no armies, yet it held the hearts of the Arab tribes in a grip of iron devotion. There stood the Kaaba, a simple cube of rough black stone, unadorned and draped in cloth, seemingly insignificant beside the towering splendor of Al-Kulays. It gnawed at Abraha's soul like a parasite that the pilgrims ignored his architectural miracle, turning their backs on his gold-encrusted sanctuary to walk barefoot across the scorching sands toward that ancient, weathered house built by the patriarch Abraham. He watched from his high windows as the seasons turned, expecting the sheer magnitude of his wealth to divert the flow of humanity, believing that men were moths drawn solely to the brightest flame. But the caravans continued to bypass Sana'a, their eyes fixed on the northern horizon, their chants praising the Lord of the house, not the Lord of the cathedral. The silence of the empty pews in Al-Kulays was deafening, a mockery that echoed through the vast, hollow halls, whispering to the tyrant that his power was an illusion and his grandeur a lie. This rejection festered into a poisonous hatred, a cold resolve that transcended mere political strategy and entered the realm of spiritual warfare. Abraha did not understand that the reverence for the Kaaba was woven into the very lineage of the people, a bond forged not by masonry but by a divine covenant that no amount of marble could sever. He saw only defiance where there was faith, and he saw only competition where there was sanctity. In his arrogance, he mistook the patience of the divine for absence, unaware that he was merely a player in a cosmic tragedy written long before he drew his first breath. The shimmering walls of Al-Kulays, intended to be a beacon of glory, were slowly transforming into a monument to his own hubris, a golden cage where his envy grew large and monstrous. He began to dictate letters to his master in Aksum, words filled with venom and promise, swearing that if the Arabs would not come to his church willingly, he would force the world to forget the Kaaba ever existed. The atmosphere in Sana'a grew tense, the heat oppressive, as if the very land recoiled from the blasphemy taking root in the heart of its ruler. It was the calm before a cataclysm, the deceptive stillness of a predator waiting to strike, for Abraha had decided that if he could not steal the pilgrims' love, he would destroy the object of their affection, setting in motion a chain of events that would bring him face to face with a might far greater than his own, the crushing power of Al-Azeez. Word of the vice-regent's arrogance did not stay confined within the jeweled walls of Sana'a, but rather it traveled north on the scorching breath of the desert wind, carried by the tongues of outraged merchants and the whispers of Bedouin wanderers until it reached the ears of the tribes of the Hijaz. It was a proclamation that struck at the very marrow of their identity, a boast that the ancient rights of their forefathers were to be nullified by the masonry of an Ethiopian usurper. Among those who heard this blasphemous decree was a man of the Kinana tribe, a lineage known for its fierce loyalty to the sanctuary in Mecca, and within his chest, a fire was kindled that burned hotter than the midday sun. He did not gather an army, nor did he shout from the mountaintops, but instead wrapped himself in the cloak of shadows and began a solitary journey southward, walking into the lion's den with nothing but malice in his heart and a grim determination to shatter the illusion of Al-Kolay's sanctity. He moved like a ghost through the rocky passes and across the dusty plains, his eyes fixed on the distant glint of the cathedral's spire, driven by a primal need to answer insult with a desecration so profound it would scream across history. Under the cover of a moonless night, when the city of Sana'a lay in a stupor of wine and exhaustion, the man of Kinana slipped past the drowsy guards who stood watch over the tyrant's prize. The great doors of the cathedral, crafted to intimidate kings, yielded to his stealth, and he stepped into the cavernous hall where the air was heavy with the cloying scent of frankincense and the silence was as thick as a burial shroud. He stood there for a moment, a speck of dust amidst the grandeur, looking upon the gold-leafed columns and the mosaics that mocked the simplicity of the Kaaba, and he felt not awe, but a deep, churning revulsion. In a final act of supreme contempt, he did not smash the idols or steal the chalices, instead, he squatted upon the pristine marble floors and relieved himself, smearing his own filth across the walls and the altars, dragging the excrement of a mortal man over the symbols of Abraham's divine pretension. It was a crude, visceral rejection, a statement written in the foulest medium possible that this place was no house of God, but merely a gilded toilet for the vanity of a tyrant. He vanished into the night as silently as he had come, leaving behind a stench that would ignite a war. When the dawn broke and the priests arrived to chant their morning hymns, they were met not with the fragrance of holiness but with the suffocating reek of human waste. The discovery sent a shockwave of horror through the palace, for the defilement was absolute and undeniable, a brown stain upon the white purity of the emperor's dream. When the news was brought to Abraham, he did not scream, rather, a terrifying stillness descended upon him, the calm of a sea before the tsunami breaks. His pride, which was the very architecture of his soul, had been dismantled by a single anonymous Arab who had treated his magnum opus with less respect than a dunghill. The message was clear: no matter how high you build, you cannot compel the heart to worship. The blood drained from Abraham's face, leaving it a mask of pale leather, and in that moment of humiliation, his ambition calcified into a singular, murderous purpose. He swore a solemn oath by his sovereign and his gods that he would not rest until he had marched upon the source of this defiance, the Kaaba itself, and razed it to the ground so thoroughly that future generations would not know a stone had ever stood there. The orders went forth with the speed of a pestilence, summoning every vassal and mercenary from the corners of the kingdom to assemble for a campaign of annihilation. The ground began to tremble as the ranks swelled, a gathering of 60,000 men clad in leather and mail, a force of destruction such as the Arabian Peninsula had never witnessed. But the terror of this army lay not in its numbers, but in its vanguard. Abraham commanded that his ultimate weapon be brought forward, a creature of nightmare plucked from the savannas of Africa. It was Mahmud, a massive elephant of war, a grey leviathan whose tusks were capped with iron and whose skin was thick enough to turn aside the sharpest spear. The beast loomed over the soldiers like a living siege engine, a monster that did not belong in the delicate ecosystem of the desert, representing a brute force that mocked the natural order. Beside Mahmud marched 12 other elephants, a phalanx of giants destined to trample the sacred house into dust. As the army began its slow, thundering march northward, the very earth seemed to groan in protest, the dust rising in a choking cloud that blotted out the sun. Abraham rode at the head of this serpent of steel and flesh, his eyes dead to the beauty of the world, seeing only the crumbling walls of the Kaaba in his mind's eye. He was a man possessed, driving 60,000 souls toward a destiny that was already written, blind to the fact that he was marching not against a tribe or a city, but against the attribute of Al-Azeez, the one who possesses a might that can pulverize the mountains and halt the giants in their tracks. The desert waited in silence, holding its breath for the collision between the arrogance of the created and the power of the Creator. The march northward was a spectacle of terror that seemed to tear the very fabric of the desert apart, a slow-moving avalanche of steel and flesh that defied the natural laws of the desolate landscape. 60,000 men, a number incomprehensible to the scattered Bedouin tribes, flowed like a river of molten iron across the dunes, their armor clattering in a cacophony that drowned out the howling winds. But it was not the sheer mass of humanity that froze the blood of those who watched from the craggy peaks, it was the beasts. 13 elephants, led by the colossal Mahmud, plodded through the sands with a terrifying, inexorable rhythm, their grey bulks blotting out the horizon like storm clouds made manifest. To the Arabs of the Hijaz, who knew only the horse and the camel, these creatures were monsters from a forgotten age, living siege engines whose trunks could snap a man in two and whose tread pulverized the rocky earth into fine powder. The heat was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of shimmering distortion, yet Abraha pressed on with the feverish intensity of a man possessed, his eyes fixed on a vision of destruction that rendered him blind to the suffering of his own legions. Water skins ran dry, and men dropped like flies, their bodies left to bake in the merciless sun, but the tyrant did not pause, for his hatred of the Kaaba was a thirst that no water could quench. Resistance proved as futile as trying to hold back the tide with a sieve. A nobleman of Yemen, Dhu Nafr, had rallied his kin in a desperate attempt to halt the invasion, calling upon the ancient honor of the Arabs to defend the sacred house, but his valor was crushed beneath the sheer weight of the Abyssinian advance. His army was scattered like chaff in a gale, and he himself was taken in chains, forced to march in the shadow of the very beast he had sought to stop, a living trophy of Abraha's invincibility. The psychological toll of this defeat rippled ahead of the army, sowing panic in every settlement. When the horde reached the lands of the Thaqif tribe in Ta'if, the inhabitants, terrified that their own shrines would be razed, surrendered without lifting a sword. In a display of cowardice that would stain their reputation for generations, they not only opened their gates but offered a guide, a traitor named Abu Righal, to lead the destroyers through the treacherous mountain passes directly to the Holy Valley. The very earth seemed to reject this treachery. Legends would later whisper that when Abu Righal finally died on the road, his grave became a site of eternal scorn, stoned by travelers for centuries as a monument to the man who sold his soul to the enemy of God. As the army descended into the precinct of Al-Magamas, a mere stopping point on the outskirts of Mecca, the air grew thick with a tension that was almost electric. Here, Abraha unleashed his scouts, who swept through the grazing lands like locusts, seizing the wealth of the Tihama tribes. Among the plunder were 200 camels belonging to Abdul Muttalib, the chief of the Quraysh and the grandfather of the Prophet, a man whose lineage commanded the respect of the entire peninsula. The Meccans, realizing the hopelessness of military resistance against such a monolithic force, had fled to the mountaintops, leaving the city below silent and empty, a ghost town waiting for the apocalypse. The Kaaba stood alone in the valley, draped in its simple cloth, seemingly abandoned by its people, a fragile cube of stone awaiting the impact of the elephant's skull. Yet, the silence of the city was not one of defeat, but of a terrifying, breathless waiting, as if the valley itself was holding its breath for a divine intervention that the invaders could not comprehend. It was in this atmosphere of impending doom that Abdul Muttalib came down from the mountains, walking unarmed into the heart of the enemy camp. He was a man of immense physical presence, tall and handsome, with a face that radiated a calm dignity which stood in stark contrast to the chaotic opulence of the Abyssinian tents. When he was brought before Abraha, the tyrant was so struck by the Arab chief's noble bearing that he descended from his throne and sat beside him on the carpet, treating him not as a conquered savage but as an equal. Through an interpreter, Abraha asked what favor the chief of Mecca desired, fully expecting a plea for the safety of the city or a negotiation to spare the temple. The air in the tent hung heavy, the smell of roasted meat and heavy perfume mingling with the sharp scent of fear from the attendants. Abdul Muttalib looked the tyrant in the eye, his expression unreadable, and spoke words that would ring through history with the clarity of a bell. He did not ask for the salvation of the Kaaba, he asked only for the return of his 200 camels. Abraha was stunned, his respect evaporating in an instant, replaced by a sneering contempt. He expressed his disbelief that the leader of the Quraysh would worry about livestock when the very house of his religion, the sanctuary of his ancestors, was about to be obliterated from the face of the earth. The tyrant mocked the misplaced priorities of the Arab, seeing in this request a confirmation of the pettiness of the people he had come to destroy. But Abdul Muttalib did not flinch. With a voice as steady as the mountains that ringed the valley, he delivered a reply that stripped the situation down to its terrifying spiritual reality. He declared that he was merely the lord of the camels and thus responsible for them, but as for the house, it had a lord of its own, and he would surely protect it. It was a statement of such profound, bone-deep reliance on the divine that it left Abraham momentarily speechless. The tyrant waved him away, returning the camels in a gesture of dismissive arrogance, believing that the Arab's god was as impotent as the stone idols he intended to smash. Abdul-Muttalib took his livestock and ascended back into the hills, gathering his people to watch, leaving the valley floor clear for the confrontation between the arrogance of created might and the silent, brooding power of the Creator. The sun set over the jagged peaks, casting long, blood-red shadows across the valley, and the great elephant Mahmud trumpeted into the twilight, a sound of war that echoed against the silent walls of the Kaaba, unaware that the dawn would bring a terror beyond the imagining of any mortal king. The sun rose on that fateful morning with a sickly, bruised light, casting long, distorted shadows across the valley of Muhassir, a stretch of accursed earth lying between the encampment and the holy precincts of Mecca. It was a dawn stripped of hope, heavy with a suffocating silence that pressed against the eardrums of the 60,000 men who stood ready to commit the ultimate blasphemy. The air was still, unnaturally so, as if the desert wind itself dared not breathe in the presence of the atrocity that was about to unfold. Abraha al-Ashram, clad in armor that shone like the carapace of a scarab beetle, sat atop his charger, his heart beating with the rhythmic thrum of inevitable conquest. He gave the signal, a sharp gesture that rippled through the ranks, commanding the drummers to beat the cadence of doom and the trumpeters to sound the charge that would signal the end of the ancient house. The ground began to vibrate, not with an earthquake, but with the synchronized tread of thousands of boots and hooves, a man-made tremor designed to shatter the resolve of the invisible enemy. But the centerpiece of this terrifying display, the great elephant Mahmud, the mountain of gray flesh upon which the entire psychological weight of the invasion rested, did not move. The beast stood like a statue hewn from granite, his massive legs planted deep into the shifting sands, his trunk hanging limp and motionless. The handlers, men with skin like leather and hearts hardened by years of brutalizing nature, shouted commands that had never failed to rouse the Leviathan before. They tugged at the heavy chains, the iron links clanking a mournful dirge against the tusks, but Mahmud remained frozen, his small, intelligent eyes fixed on the invisible boundary of the sanctuary with a look of abject terror that no animal should possess. Panic began to bubble in the chest of Yunus, the chief handler, for to halt now, at the very threshold of victory, was to invite the wrath of a king who accepted no failure. He raised his iron hook, a cruel instrument with a wicked, rusted point, and drove it into the soft flesh behind the elephant's ear, dragging it down with a sickening tear. The beast trumpeted, a sound of agony that shivered the spines of the nearby soldiers, yet it did not advance a single inch toward the Kaaba. It was as if a wall of diamond, unseen by human eyes but blazing with celestial fire to the senses of the animal, stood between the creature and the house of God. Desperate to break the beast's resolve, the handlers resorted to a violence that was difficult to witness. They beat the creature's head with maces, they jabbed spears into its flanks, turning its grey hide into a map of weeping red wounds, but Mahmud simply knelt. The great beast collapsed onto its front knees, lowering its massive bulk into the dust in a posture of supreme submission, not to the men beating it, but to something vast and terrifying that loomed over the valley. In a frantic attempt to understand this madness, the handlers jerked the elephant's head toward the south, toward Yemen. Immediately, the beast rose with a renewed vigor and broke into a trot, eager to flee. They turned him toward the east, and he moved freely. They turned him toward the north, toward Syria, and he walked without hesitation. But the moment they wrenched his head back toward the Kaaba, toward the simple cube of stone waiting in the silence, Mahmud's legs buckled as if the bones had turned to water, and he collapsed once more, wheezing in the dust, an immovable anchor dropped by the hand of the divine. A murmur of unease rippled through the ranks of the Abyssinians, a cold seed of doubt that sprouted instantly into fear. The soldiers looked at one another, their eyes wide within their helmets, for even the dullest mind could sense that the natural order had been suspended. The horses began to whinny and rear, their nostrils flaring as they caught a scent on the wind that was not of this earth, a smell of ozone and ancient, gathering wrath. Then, the light began to fail. It did not fade gradually as with the setting sun, but was snuffed out by a sudden, rushing darkness that swept in from the direction of the Red Sea. The soldiers looked up, shielding their eyes, expecting a storm cloud, but what they saw froze the marrow in their bones. It was a living carpet, a seething, shrieking canopy of birds, distinct and peculiar, unlike the eagles or vultures of the desert. These were the Ababil, vast flocks of swift-like creatures, small and dark, their wings beating with a sound like the tearing of heavy canvas. They came in waves that blotted out the sky, plunging the valley into a twilight of horror. Each bird carried 3 stones of baked clay, 1 in its beak and 2 in its claws, pebbles no larger than a chickpea or a lentil, marked with a seal that no mortal could read. To the arrogant eyes of Abraham, looking up from his halted vanguard, the sight might have seemed absurd at first, a flock of swallows against an army of steel, but the absurdity vanished the moment the first stone fell. The heavens opened, and the rain of baked clay descended with the velocity of meteorites. This was not a bombardment of simple rocks, it was a targeted execution. When a stone struck a soldier, it did not merely bruise or break bone, it pierced through the iron helmet as if it were made of wet paper, drove through the skull, passed through the torso, and exited through the groin, burying itself deep into the earth beneath the victim. The sound of the slaughter was a cacophony of wet, tearing impacts and screams that were cut short by instantaneous death. The carnage was absolute and gruesome, a scene of devastation that defied all logic of warfare. Men were not just killed, they were dissolved. The stones carried a pestilence, a divine corrosion that caused flesh to rot and fall away from the bone in seconds, leaving the mighty army of 60,000 looking, as the ancient verses would later describe, like chewed straw left in a field, hollow, broken, and utterly consumed. Chaos erupted in the valley of Mahasar. The elephants, maddened by the stinging rain and the scent of blood, turned on their masters, trampling the fleeing infantry into a paste of gore and sand. Horses, their riders liquefied in the saddles, galloped blindly into the ravine, shattering their legs. The carefully organized ranks of the Abyssinian war machine disintegrated into a frantic, screaming mob, every man clawing over his brother in a desperate bid to escape the sky that was murdering them. There was no enemy to fight, no sword to parry, only the relentless, humming descent of the stones and the terrifying accuracy of the birds that swirled overhead like demons released from the pit. The ground became a slurry of blood and dissolving tissue, a swamp of death where the pride of Abraham drowned in its own hubris. Abraham himself, the man who would be a god, was struck. He did not die instantly, for his punishment was to be prolonged, a slow and agonizing unraveling of his physical form to mirror the unraveling of his soul. A stone grazed his flesh, and the rot set in immediately. His fingertips began to fall off, his skin weeping a foul ichor as his body began to disintegrate while he yet breathed. He was hoisted onto a litter by the few terry-fed survivors, a broken, trembling wreck of a king, screaming orders that no one obeyed, his voice cracking with the realization of his total impotence. As he was carried away from the valley of death, leaving behind the carcass of his great army and the kneeling form of Mahmud, he looked back one last time at the Kaaba. The house stood untouched, silent and serene amidst the whirlwind of destruction, protected not by walls or armies, but by the name of Al-Azeez, the mighty, the one whose power cannot be challenged. The birds circled, their work done, as the silence of the grave descended once more upon the valley, leaving a testament to the world that whoever wars against the divine is already defeated before the first arrow is loosed. The silence that followed the departure of the Ababil was more terrifying than the shrieking storm that had preceded it. It was the silence of a tomb, broken only by the wet, gurgling rasps of men whose bodies were rebelling against the laws of physiology, and the maddened trumpeting of the few elephants that had not been scoured from the earth. The valley of Mahasar, only hours before a staging ground for the greatest army the peninsula had ever seen, had been transmuted into a charnel house of such grotesque proportions that the mind recoiled from the sight of it. The sun, climbing high toward its zenith, beat down upon the carnage with an indifferent fury, baking the stench of ozone, blood, and ruptured bowels into a thick, invisible miasma that choked the survivors. This was not a battlefield in any sense understood by the captains of war. There were no glorious dead, no lines of honor, no clashes of steel. There was only the soup of organic matter, the red paste of men and beasts mashed together into the gravel, and the wandering, ghost-like figures of those who had been spared the immediate mercy of death only to suffer a far more hideous dissolution. The birds had vanished as quickly as they had arrived, disappearing into the infinite blue vault of the sky like a nightmare retracting its claws, leaving behind a devastation that looked less like the aftermath of combat and more like the result of a sudden, violent plague sent to scour the wickedness from the land. Abraha al-Ashram, the vice-regent of the Negus, the builder of Al-Kullays, the man who had dreamed of stealing the center of the world, was now a wretched thing, a passenger in his own personal hell. He had not been granted the swift exit of a stone through the skull. Instead, the baked clay had grazed him, implanting a seed of necrosis that spread with terrifying velocity. His retreat from the holy precincts was not a military maneuver but a chaotic, screaming flight of the damned. The remnants of the army, a ragged band of soldiers whose minds had snapped under the weight of the supernatural assault, hoisted their king onto a litter, their hands slippery with the fluids weeping from his skin. They turned their backs on the Kaaba, that simple, silent cube which stood inviolate against the backdrop of their ruin, and began the long, agonizing trek back toward Yemen. The journey that had taken them weeks to complete in their pride would now become a death march of unparalleled horror, a pilgrimage of pain that would stain the sands of the Hijaz for a generation. Every step south was a battle against a disintegration that was happening from the inside out. The curse carried by the stones was not merely physical trauma, it was a divine enzyme, a command to the flesh to return to the dust from which it came, bypassing the natural order of decay. As the shattered column limped through the treacherous passes, leaving a trail of dropped weapons, armor, and gold, wealth that was now meaningless, the soldiers began to fall away one by one. It was a scene of eldritch horror. A man would be walking, clutching his water skin, and suddenly his hand would detach at the wrist, the flesh having turned to a necrotic jelly, or his leg would give way as the femur simply dissolved within the meat of the thigh. They dropped like flies in a frost, their bodies curling into the fetal position as they were consumed by the invisible fire of the wrath of Al-Azeez. The roadside became a graveyard of the unburied, a feast for the hyenas and the vultures who, unlike the divine birds, belonged to the earth and came to pick at the scraps of the tyrant's vanity. The grand elephants, those mountains of war, were not spared. The few that survived the initial barrage succumbed to madness and thirst, collapsing in the wadis, their massive carcasses becoming landmarks of failure that travelers would point to with superstitious dread for centuries to come. The stench of the retreating army was so potent that it reportedly drove the wild beasts from their dens, a reek of rot that traveled on the wind ahead of them, announcing their shame before they could even be seen. Abraha lay upon his litter, drifting in and out of a delirium that was worse than any nightmare. His body was literally falling apart. The historical accounts, preserved with grim precision, speak of a suffering that transcends the capacity of medical language to describe. His fingers fell off, one by one, leaving raw, weeping stumps that refused to clot. His nose, the symbol of his haughty pride, was eaten away by the gangrene, leaving a gaping cavity in the center of his face. His skin grew translucent and black, sloughing off in sheets to reveal the pulsing muscles and the gleam of bone beneath. Yet, the angel of death withheld his hand, denying the tyrant the release of oblivion. He was forced to remain conscious, to witness the dismantling of his own vessel, to feel every nerve-ending scream as it was exposed to the dry desert air. He shouted orders to captains who were already dead, he bargained with a god he had tried to war against, he wept tears that turned to acid on his ruined cheeks. The mighty king who had sat upon the throne of Sana'a, draped in silk and gold, was now a mass of putrefaction, a living lesson inscribed in the flesh that grandeur belongs only to the Creator. The route back was a labyrinth of despair. The guides who had led them with such confidence were either dead or had fled into the wilderness, their minds broken by the sight of the impossible. The army wandered in circles, parched and blind, stumbling into ravines and over precipices. The water supplies had been tainted or lost in the panic, and thirst became a second tormentor, swelling their tongues until they choked on their own thirst. They were hounded not by human pursuers, for the Quraysh remained in the mountains, watching in awed silence, but by their own shadows. Every rustle of the wind sounded like the beating of wings, every shifting cloud looked like the return of the Ababil. The psychological terror was total. Men tore at their own faces, gouged out their eyes to stop seeing the ghosts of their comrades, or threw themselves upon their own swords to escape the slow rot that they feared was contagious. And indeed, it seemed contagious, not as a germ, but as a doom. To touch Abraha was to touch the epicenter of the curse, yet his guards, bound by a loyalty that was now indistinguishable from madness, carried him onward, bearing the weight of their decaying king like a holy relic of the perverse. When the remnants of the expedition finally crossed the border back into Yemen, they were no longer an army. They were a procession of ghouls. The news of their calamity had outpaced them, carried by the swift riders of rumor, and the people of Sana'a waited with bated breath, expecting to see the spoils of Mecca and the glory of their vice-regent. Instead, they saw a horror show. The 60,000 had been reduced to a handful of skeletal survivors, men with missing limbs, eyes burned white by the sun, and minds shattered into shards of glass. And at the center of this parade of the damned was Abraha. As they entered the gates of the city, the very city where he had built his cathedral to rival the stars, a hush fell over the population that was heavier than the stones of Al-Kulays. The cathedral stood there, its gold still gleaming, its mosaics still bright, but it now looked like a sepulchre, a monument to a folly so colossal it chilled the soul. They carried the litter into the palace, the blood and pus dripping onto the expensive carpets, staining the intricate weaves with the fluids of divine retribution. Abraha was lifted from his conveyance, a task that required the utmost care lest he disintegrate in their hands. He was placed not on his throne, but on a bed of suffering, his body a ruin of what it once was. The final stage of his punishment was at hand. As the physicians and courtiers gathered around, covering their faces to mask the smell of the grave that emanated from their living king, Abraha's chest began to split open. It was the final unmaking. The rib cage, weakened by the mysterious rot, gave way, the flesh parting like a ripped garment to expose the thoracic cavity. Those who stood witness recoiled in horror, for there, amidst the ruin of his body, his heart continued to beat. It was exposed to the open air, thumping with a ragged, desperate rhythm, a visceral symbol that his life was being sustained solely for the purpose of prolonged agony. He looked down at his own beating heart, the engine of his ambition, now naked and vulnerable, trembling like a bird trapped in a cage of bone. It was the ultimate unveiling, the stripping away of every layer of protection, dignity, and strength until only the raw, trembling core remained. In those final hours, lying in the heart of his capital, surrounded by the opulence he had hoarded, Abraha al-Ashram came face to face with the reality of his station. He was not a god. He was not a king of kings. He was dust, animated for a brief spark of time, and now being returned to dust by a will that shattered iron as easily as it shattered pride. The cathedral of Al-Kulays loomed outside his window, a silent witness to his demise, its bells silent, its pews empty. The elephants were dead. The army was dust. The Kaaba still stood. The contrast was absolute. The man who had sought to displace the center of worship had been displaced from his own body. His breathing grew shallow, a rattling wheeze that filled the chamber, and his eyes, wide with the terror of the unseen, fixed upon the ceiling as if seeing the face of the angel come to claim his wretched soul. The might of Al-Azeez had been demonstrated not through a war of attrition, but through a total, humiliating dismantling of the aggressor, leaving behind a story that would be whispered in fear by every tyrant who dared to look toward the holy house with malice. The sun set over Sana'a, plunging the room into shadow, and with a final, wet shudder, the heart of the elephant master faltered, and the darkness took him. The death of Abraha al-Ashram did not bring an immediate peace, but rather a suffocating stillness that hung over the southern peninsula like a shroud woven from shock and disbelief. The tyrant was dead, his chest burst open by the will of the unseen, his heart silenced by the decree of the divine, yet the shadow of his ambition lingered in the cool, dark halls of the palace in Sana'a. The courtiers and the generals, those few who had not been liquefied in the valley of Muhassir, moved through the corridors like phantoms, speaking in hushed tones, terrified that to raise their voices would be to invite the return of the birds. The Cathedral of Al-Quds, that gargantuan monument to human vanity, stood silent and imposing against the skyline, but its aura had changed irrevocably. It was no longer a beacon of a new era or a house of worship, it was a mausoleum of hubris. The gold leaf that adorned its dome seemed to lose its luster overnight, tarnishing under the weight of the curse that had befallen its builder, and the teak wood, brought at such great cost from the east, began to groan in the wind as if weeping for the futility of its own existence. The pilgrims did not come. The great deflection of the Hajj that Abraha had staked his soul upon never materialized. Instead, the cathedral became a place of superstition and dread, a haunted hollow where the wind whistled through the empty arches, sounding suspiciously like the trumpeting of a dying elephant. In time, the local tribes would strip it of its jewels and its precious metals, scavenging the carcass of the king's dream until only the stone skeleton remained, a jagged tooth rotting in the mouth of the city, serving as a grim reminder that that which is built for the glory of self is destined for ruin, while that which is dedicated to the glory of God remains eternal. Far to the north, in the rugged, sun-bleached valley of Mecca, the atmosphere was one of bewildered jubilation mixed with a profound, trembling reverence. The Quraysh came down from the mountain peaks, their eyes scanning the horizon for the dust of the great army, but they found only silence. They walked tentatively toward the Kaaba, half expecting it to be a mirage, half expecting the ground to open up and swallow them whole. But the house stood. The black cloth that draped it fluttered gently in the breeze, undisturbed, untouched, as if the apocalypse that had consumed 60,000 men a mere few miles away had happened on a different planet. Abdul-Muttalib, the grandfather who had faced the tyrant and demanded only his camels, approached the sanctuary with tears streaming down his face, his hands trembling as he touched the rough, ancient stones. He knew, with a certainty that transcended the pagan idolatry of his time, that this victory belonged to no man, to no sword, and to no strategy. It was a direct intervention, a severing of the rope of the oppressor by the hand of the Lord of the house. The Arabs of the Hijaz, a people fragmented by tribal feuds and blood debts, were suddenly united by a singular, overwhelming realization: they were the custodians of a place that the heavens themselves would go to war to protect. The year of the elephant, or Am al-Fil, became the epoch by which all time was measured, a demarcation line in the sand of history that separated the age of forgetfulness from the age of awakening. Yet, the true climax of this saga was not the death of a king, nor the survival of a building, but an event that occurred in the quiet aftermath, a ripple in the cosmic ocean that would turn into a tidal wave of light. 50 days, or perhaps 55 nights after the destruction of the elephant and its master, a woman named Amina bint Wahb, the daughter of a noble clan, sat in the humble dwellings of the Banu Hashim. She was heavy with child, a widow whose husband Abdullah had passed into the mercy of the grave before he could see his son. The city was still buzzing with the tales of the Ababil, of the stones of baked clay, and the might of the unseen, but within the womb of Amina lay the very reason for that protection. It was not merely for a pile of rocks that the army of the abyss was shattered, it was to preserve the sanctuary for the arrival of the one who would purify it. On a Monday in the month of Rabi al-Awwal, as the stars faded from the pre-dawn sky, Amina gave birth to a boy. She named him Muhammad. The histories whisper that his birth was accompanied by a light that shone forth from her, illuminating the palaces of Basra and Syria, a physical manifestation of the illumination he would bring to a world steeped in the darkness of ignorance. The timing was divine poetry written in the blood of tyrants and the milk of a mother. The greatest display of Allah's martial power, the crushing of Abraha, served as the immediate prelude to his greatest display of mercy, the sending of the final messenger. The tyrant who sought to destroy the house was obliterated so that the orphan who would cleanse the house could be born in safety. This boy would grow up in the shadow of the Kaaba, walking the very sands where the elephant Mahmud had knelt in submission. He would hear the elders recount the story of the birds and the stones by the firelight, absorbing the lesson that material power is an illusion before the might of the Creator. 40 years later, when the mantle of prophethood was placed upon his shoulders and the revelation began to descend, the story of the elephant would be immortalized in the Quran, in a short, thunderous chapter that would be recited by billions of tongues until the end of time. Surah Al-Fil would stand as a terrifying warning and a comforting promise. Have you not considered how your Lord dealt with the companions of the elephant? Did he not make their plan go astray? And he sent against them birds in flocks, striking them with stones of hard clay, and he made them like eaten straw. It was a rhetorical question addressed to the prophet, a reminder that the same Al-Azeez who defended the house when he was but a fetus in the womb was the same guardian who would protect him against the persecution of his own people. The legacy of Abraham was sealed not in the gold of his cathedral, but in the verses of the book he had tried to prevent, ensuring that his name would be remembered forever only as a footnote to the glory of the God he challenged. The attribute of Al-Azeez, the mighty, the invincible, the one to whom belongs all honor and power, was etched into the consciousness of the Arabs through this event. It redefined the understanding of strength. Abraham had the strength of numbers, the strength of technology, the strength of the massive beast, and the strength of political will. To the eyes of the world, he was unstoppable. He was the irresistible force. But Al-Azeez is the one who renders the irresistible irrelevant. He did not send a bigger elephant, he sent a bird. He did not send a massive boulder, he sent a pebble. He did not send an army of giants, he sent a flock of fragile creatures to dismantle the machine of war. This is the subtlety of true might, that it does not need to exert effort to destroy the arrogant. The disparity between the weapon and the destruction is the signature of the divine. By destroying the mightiest army with the smallest soldiers, Allah demonstrated that power does not reside in the creation, but solely in the command of the Creator. The absolute humiliation of Abraham was necessary to strip away the facade of human sovereignty, leaving the stage bare for the message of Tawhid, the oneness of God. As the years turned into centuries, and the centuries into millennia, the story of the elephant and the tyrant became a cornerstone of faith, a narrative refuge for the oppressed. It taught that when the world is dark, when the enemy is at the gates, when the calculations of men say that defeat is inevitable, there is a factor that cannot be calculated. The Kaaba still stands, draped in black, circled by a sea of white-clad pilgrims who chant the name of the One Lord, their footsteps wearing down the marble in a tawaf that mimics the rotation of the galaxies. And somewhere, buried beneath the shifting sands of the road to Yemen, lies the dust of a man who thought he could fight God, his name spoken only as a warning, his cathedral a phantom memory, his mighty elephant a symbol of stubbornness. The ultimate victor was not the Quraysh, nor the Arabs, but the attribute of Al-Azeez, asserting an eternal truth, that all pride which rises against the heavens will be brought low, and that which is humble before the divine shall be exalted. The shocking transformation was complete, from a world trembling before the might of a man, to a world bowing before the glory of the One. The story ends not with a bang, but with the enduring, triumphant silence of the sanctuary, witnessing the passing of empires while it remains, guarded by the Lord of the worlds, waiting for the return of the faithful, just as it waited on that terrifying morning when the sky turned black with birds. The lesson is carved into the bedrock of history: there is no refuge from Allah, except in Allah.